March 1603. Richmond Palace. Guards heard it first, a sound like cracking wood, echoing from the chamber where England's greatest queen lay dead. When they entered, the stench hit them like a wall. Elizabeth's coffin had split open. Her body, swollen with putrefaction gases, had burst through the wood like something from a nightmare. The woman who ruled an empire for 45 years was now unrecognizable, her corpse expanding in the darkness. This wasn't supposed to happen to royalty, but Elizabeth made a choice before she died, one that would turn her final days into a horror story. If you want to uncover the darkest secrets history tried to bury, hit that subscribe button, because what happened next gets even worse. Winter had never felt colder at Richmond Palace. By January 1603, those who served Elizabeth noticed the change. The woman who once danced until dawn now moved like a ghost through corridors she had walked for 70 years. Her ladies-in-waiting exchanged glances, but said nothing. Queens do not weaken. Queens do not fade. But Elizabeth was fading. She refused her bed. Night after night, attendants found her standing in her chambers, staring at nothing, her body swaying with exhaustion. When they begged her to rest, she waved them away with skeletal hands. Sleep had become her enemy. Perhaps she knew that if she lay down, she might never rise again. The melancholy had started after Essex, Robert Devereux, the young earl she had loved like a son, executed 2 years earlier for treason. She had signed his death warrant herself, and the guilt consumed her. In the final weeks, servants heard her muttering his name in the darkness. Some swore they saw tears on her painted face. By February, she stopped speaking entirely. The queen, who had commanded parliaments with her words, now communicated only in gestures and cold stares. Her physicians hovered nearby, desperate to help, but she refused them all. No potions, no bloodletting, no examinations. She sat in silence, her mind somewhere else, somewhere beyond their reach. Then came the ring. Elizabeth had worn her coronation ring for 45 years, never once removing it. The golden band had become part of her flesh, embedded so deeply that skin had grown over the metal. It symbolized her marriage to England, an eternal bond that could not be broken. But in early March, her fingers had swollen so grotesquely that the ring cut into her flesh like a blade. Her ladies tried everything: oil, soap, gentle twisting. Nothing worked. The ring had become a shackle, and Elizabeth screamed as they pulled at it. Finally, they had no choice. A jeweler was summoned with a tiny saw. The queen, who had never shown weakness, wept as they cut the symbol of her power from her finger. After that, something inside her broke. She stopped eating. Food was brought to her chambers and taken away untouched. Her body, already frail, began to collapse inward. The magnificent gowns hung loose on her frame. The white makeup she wore to hide her age could no longer conceal the hollow cheeks, the sunken eyes, the grayness creeping across her skin. Her ladies dressed her each morning in the ritual she had demanded for decades. The wig, the jewels, the rough collar starched to perfection. But beneath the costume, Elizabeth was dying, and everyone knew it. The court moved in whispers. Nobles gathered in corners, discussing what would come next, who would inherit the throne, how quickly they could pledge loyalty to a new monarch. Elizabeth heard them. She heard everything. On March 20th, she finally spoke. Just 3 words, barely audible, directed at no one in particular. Her chief lady bent close to hear. "I am tired." 4 days later, she would be dead. But in those final hours before the end, Elizabeth made a decision that would transform her death into something far worse than anyone imagined. Elizabeth had one final command for those who would handle her corpse. She spoke it clearly, ensuring witnesses heard every word. Her body was not to be opened, not for any reason. When she died, they were to leave her intact. Her ladies understood what she meant. For centuries, royal bodies had been subjected to a ritual that Elizabeth found repulsive. The moment the monarch died, Physicians would arrive with their blades and bowls. They would cut a deep incision down the torso, carve through flesh and muscle, and remove everything inside: the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the intestines. Every organ extracted and placed in vessels for separate burial. The process had a purpose. Without evisceration, a corpse would rot from the inside out within hours. The bacteria living in the gut would feast on dead tissue, producing gases that bloated the body until it became unrecognizable. Royal funerals required weeks of preparation, processions through city streets, lying in state before thousands of subjects. A body needed to last. Embalming was not optional. It was survival. But Elizabeth refused. Some believed it was vanity. The Virgin Queen had spent her entire reign crafting an image of purity, of untouched perfection. The thought of surgeons cutting her open, exposing her internal organs, violated everything she had built. She wanted to go into the ground whole, her secret sealed inside her forever. Others whispered it was fear. Elizabeth had watched her father's body swell and burst on its journey to burial. Henry VIII, so carefully embalmed, had still leaked fluids through his lead coffin, staining the floor of the chapel where he rested. If even the best physicians could not preserve a king properly, what horrors might they inflict on her? Perhaps it was control. Elizabeth had ruled England for 45 years without letting anyone dictate her choices. She had refused marriage, refused to name an heir, refused to bend to the demands of men who thought they knew better. Now, facing death, she would refuse this too. They could not force her, not while she still breathed. Her chief advisers exchanged worried glances when they heard her decision. Robert Cecil, her Secretary of State, knew the reality of decomposition. March was warming into spring. Heat accelerated rot. Without evisceration, without the herbs and spices packed into the body cavity, without the preservation techniques perfected over generations, Elizabeth's corpse would not survive the journey from Richmond to London. It certainly would not last the 3 weeks required before burial. But no one could argue with a dying queen. Her physicians stood in the hallway outside her chambers, discussing the problem in hushed voices. They knew what would happen. The gases would build. The flesh would bloat. The skin would discolor and split. The smell would become unbearable. And when they finally sealed her in lead and wood, the pressure might continue to build inside that confined space. One physician asked the question no one wanted to answer. What if the coffin could not contain it? They would find out soon enough. Elizabeth had 3 days left to live. March 23rd arrived with gray skies and cold rain. Elizabeth had not spoken in days. Her attendants watched her sink deeper into whatever darkness consumed her mind. By evening, she had made her way to the floor. She refused the bed they had prepared. The great canopied structure, with its silk curtains and feather mattress, remained empty, while England's queen lay on a pile of cushions beside it. Perhaps the bed reminded her too much of surrender. Perhaps she simply no longer had the strength to climb into it. Her ladies did not ask. They simply arranged the cushions as comfortably as possible and kept vigil. Archbishop Whitgift arrived near midnight. The old man had served Elizabeth for years, and she had requested his presence. He knelt beside her cushions, praying in Latin, his voice a low murmur in the candlelit chamber. Elizabeth's eyes followed him, but she gave no indication she heard the words. Her breathing had become shallow, irregular, punctuated by long pauses that made everyone in the room hold their breath. Her chief ladies surrounded her: Lady Scrope, Lady Southwell, the Countess of Nottingham, women who had dressed her, advised her, kept her secrets for decades. They held her hands, stroked her forehead, whispered reassurances she probably could not hear. Outside the chamber door, guards stood silent. Beyond them, the palace had gone quiet. Everyone knew. Around 2 in the morning, Elizabeth's eyes suddenly focused. She lifted one skeletal hand and made a gesture toward her head. Her ladies understood immediately. She wanted the crown. Not the physical object locked away in the tower, but the symbolic acknowledgement of what she still was. Lady Scrope leaned close. "Your Majesty reigns still. England is yours until God takes you home." Elizabeth's hand dropped. Something like satisfaction crossed her painted face. She had ruled until the very end. No one had taken her throne while she lived. That mattered more than anything. The candles burned lower. Whitgift continued his prayers. The rain beat against the windows. Time seemed to slow, stretching each minute into an eternity. The ladies watched the rise and fall of Elizabeth's chest, counting breaths, knowing each one might be the last. At 3 a.m, the breathing stopped. No dramatic final words. No grand pronouncements. Elizabeth simply ceased. One moment she was present, the next she was gone. The woman who had commanded armies, defied popes, and shaped an empire had slipped away as quietly as a candle flame extinguished by wind. For several seconds, no one moved. They stared at her body on the cushions, waiting for another breath that would not come. Lady Scrope finally reached out and closed Elizabeth's eyes. The others began to weep softly. Archbishop Whitgift stood, his knees aching from kneeling so long. He made the sign of the cross over her body and spoke the words that changed everything. "The Queen is dead." Within minutes, guards sealed the chamber. No one else would enter until morning. Outside, messengers were already mounting horses, racing through the rain to carry news across England. Elizabeth Tudor had died without naming an heir. The throne was empty. The kingdom held its breath. But inside that sealed chamber, a different crisis was beginning. Elizabeth's body, unembalmed and untouched, had already started its transformation into something her attendants would struggle to forget. Dawn broke over Richmond Palace, and with it came the reality no one wanted to face. Elizabeth's body could not remain on those cushions much longer. Lady Scrope had been the first to notice. Around 5 a.m, still keeping watch in the sealed chamber, she detected something faint in the air. At first she thought it was the extinguished candles, or perhaps the dampness from the rain outside. But as the morning light crept through the windows, the smell grew stronger. Sweet and wrong. The unmistakable beginning of decay. The other ladies pretended not to notice. They busied themselves with preparing the chamber, arranging Elizabeth's belongings, whispering prayers. But they all knew. Without the immediate intervention of surgeons, without the removal of the organs that were already breaking down inside her, the Queen's body had become a vessel for processes that would not wait for anyone's comfort. By mid-morning, when Robert Cecil finally arrived with official witnesses to confirm the death, he stopped in the doorway. His face went pale. The smell had intensified enough that even from several feet away, the reality was obvious. He pulled a handkerchief from his sleeve and pressed it to his nose, stepping forward to perform his duty. One look at Elizabeth's face told him everything he needed to know. Her skin had lost the alabaster pallor she had maintained with makeup for so many years. Now it had taken on a grayish tone, and in some places, a faint purple discoloration was beginning to appear. Her jaw had gone slack. The careful arrangement of her body on the cushions could not disguise the changes happening beneath the surface. Cecil ordered the women to begin preparations immediately. They had to move quickly. The March weather was unseasonably warm, and the chamber's sealed windows had turned the room into something close to a hothouse. Every hour that passed made the situation worse. The ladies washed her body with rose water and dressed her in fresh linens, working as fast as they could while maintaining whatever dignity remained. They wrapped her in cerecloth, layers of waxed fabric meant to contain what was happening inside. But even as they worked, they could feel the subtle changes. The flesh had lost its firmness. The body had begun to swell ever so slightly as gases formed in the cavity where her organs continued their breakdown. A carpenter arrived before noon with measurements for the coffin. Lead-lined, as required for royalty, with a wooden outer casing. He worked in a separate chamber, hammering through the afternoon, while Elizabeth's attendants kept their vigil. The sound echoed through the palace. Everyone knew what it meant. By evening, the coffin was ready. They lifted Elizabeth's wrapped body from the cushions and placed her inside the lead shell. The metal would seal in what the cerecloth could not contain. Workers soldered the lid shut, trapping everything within. Then they lowered the lead coffin into its wooden casing and nailed that shut as well. 2 barriers between Elizabeth and the world. Surely that would be enough. They placed the sealed coffin in a chamber at Richmond and posted guards outside. No one was allowed to enter. Inside that sealed wooden box, inside that soldered lead shell, wrapped in waxed fabric, Elizabeth's body continued its transformation. The pressure was already building. Elizabeth Southwell was 16 years old when she became a witness to horror. As one of the Queen's maids of honor, she had been present for the final weeks, watching her mistress decline into silence and shadow. Now, with the Queen sealed in lead and wood, Southwell found herself assigned to a task that would haunt her for the rest of her life. 6 ladies were chosen to maintain the vigil. They worked in rotating shifts, never leaving the coffin unattended. The assignment carried enormous responsibility. This was England's Queen, lying in state at Richmond Palace, and nothing could be allowed to disturb her rest. The coffin sat in its designated chamber, draped in rich purple velvet that pooled on the floor around it. Candles burned at the corners. The room was kept dim, quiet, reverent. Southwell took the night watch with 2 other women. They sat on benches positioned against the walls, their eyes trained on the velvet-draped casket between them. The protocol was simple. Observe, maintain the candles. Ensure no one entered without authorization. Above all, preserve the dignity of what lay within that wooden shell. But dignity was already becoming impossible. On the first night, the smell crept under the velvet covering. Despite the lead lining, despite the cerecloth wrapping, despite every barrier the embalmers had erected, something was escaping. The other ladies noticed it too. They exchanged glances, but said nothing. What could they say? The Queen was dead. Dead bodies smelled. This was simply the reality they had to endure. By the second night, the odor had intensified. Southwell pressed a handkerchief soaked in rose water to her face during her shift. The other ladies did the same. They rotated more frequently now, no one able to bear the vigil for more than a few hours at a time. The velvet draping helped contain it somewhat, but when wind from the windows stirred the fabric, the smell rolled out in waves that made their eyes water. Southwell began to notice something else. Subtle sounds coming from inside the coffin. Soft creaks. Tiny groans of wood under pressure. At first she thought it was the palace settling, the natural sounds of an old building at night. But the noises came specifically from the casket, as if something inside was shifting, expanding, pushing against its confinement. She mentioned it to the other ladies on the third night. They had heard it too. One suggested it was the lead contracting in the cool night air. Another said it was simply their imagination, their minds playing tricks in the candlelit darkness. But Southwell knew what she heard. The coffin was not at rest. The pressure was building. 4 years later, safely in Rome and far from England's censors, Elizabeth Southwell would write down everything she witnessed. Her account, titled A True Relation of What Succeeded at the Sickness and Death of the Queen, would be dismissed by many as unreliable, tainted by her conversion to Catholicism and her distance from events. But Southwell insisted her testimony was accurate. She had been there. She had seen it with her own eyes. And what she saw on that third night would prove she was telling the truth. The sound came just after midnight. Southwell was alone in the chamber when she heard it. The other 2 ladies had stepped out briefly to refresh the rose water on their handkerchiefs, leaving her with the coffin and the guttering candles. She sat perfectly still, fighting the urge to cover her nose, when a sharp crack split the silence. It came from the casket, not the subtle creaking she had heard before. This was loud, definite, like wood splitting under enormous force. Southwell stood, her heart hammering. She took a step toward the velvet-draped coffin, then stopped. Every instinct told her not to get closer, but she was the only one there. She had to know. Another crack. This time she saw the velvet fabric move, settling slightly as if the structure beneath had shifted. A sound like tearing wood followed, and then something else. A hissing, as if air was escaping under pressure. The smell hit her like a physical blow. Whatever had been contained inside the coffin was now free. The stench was overwhelming, so thick she could taste it on her tongue. Southwell staggered backward, her hand pressed to her mouth, fighting the urge to vomit. The candles flickered wildly, their flames bending in air currents that should not have existed in the sealed chamber. The other ladies burst through the door, alerted by the noise. They stopped the moment they entered, their faces going pale. One of them screamed for the guards. Within seconds, men rushed in with torches, weapons drawn, expecting an intruder. Instead, they found 3 terrified women and a coffin that had clearly been compromised. The guard captain approached cautiously, torch held high. Even these battle-hardened men recoiled at the smell. He pulled back the velvet draping, and in the torchlight, they all saw it. The wooden casing had split along one side. A crack ran from the base almost to the lid, wide enough to see the dull gleam of lead beneath. The wood had splintered outward, as if something had pushed from within with tremendous force. Inside that sealed lead shell, inside that wooden prison, Elizabeth's body had become a laboratory of decomposition. The bacteria in her gut, deprived of oxygen but still alive, had consumed her organs, producing methane and hydrogen sulfide in quantities that transformed her abdomen into a pressurized chamber. The gases had nowhere to go. They expanded, loading the corpse, pushing against the cerecloth, pressing against the lead walls, building force with every passing hour. The lead had held. The soldered seams remained intact. But the wooden casing around, it could not withstand the pressure. The nails had held the structure rigid, preventing any give, and so the wood itself had failed. It split rather than bend, releasing the trapped gases in a violent exhalation that carried with it the unmistakable stench of putrefaction. The captain ordered everyone out except his guards. Carpenters were summoned in the middle of the night, arriving with fresh wood and iron strapping. They worked quickly, building a reinforced outer shell around the damaged casing. Additional boards were nailed in place. Metal bands were wrapped around the entire structure and bolted tight. They sealed every crack, every gap, desperately trying to contain what had already escaped. By dawn, the coffin had been transformed into something resembling a cage. No longer elegant, no longer befitting a queen, just layers of desperate containment. Elizabeth Southwell stood in the hallway, still shaking, watching the carpenters work. She would remember this night forever. The woman who had ruled England with such absolute control had become, in death, completely uncontrollable. Morning light revealed the full scope of what had happened. The chamber where Elizabeth's coffin rested had to be emptied completely. Every piece of fabric that had touched the air during the night was removed and burned. The velvet draping, the cushions where the ladies had sat, even the tapestries on the walls. Servants carried them out in bundles, their faces covered with cloth, moving as quickly as possible. The floor required scrubbing. Though nothing had actually leaked from the lead coffin itself, the violent release of gases had left an invisible residue that clung to every surface. Women arrived with buckets of water, mixed with vinegar and herbs, working on their hands and knees to erase the evidence. They burned incense afterward, filling the chamber with clouds of frankincense and myrrh, trying to mask what could not truly be cleansed. Robert Cecil issued orders that same morning. No one was to speak of what had occurred. The ladies who witnessed it, the guards who responded, the carpenters who made repairs, all received the same message: silence, absolute silence. This was not merely a request. It was a matter of preserving the dignity of the crown itself. If word spread that Elizabeth's corpse had burst its coffin, the damage to her legacy would be catastrophic. The servants who had been in the palace that night understood without being told. They had heard the crack echo through the corridors. They had smelled what followed. But they also understood the consequences of loose tongues in a royal household. Jobs could be lost. Worse punishments existed for those who spread damaging rumors about the dead queen. They kept their mouths shut and tried to forget. But forgetting proved impossible for those who had been closest. Elizabeth Southwell could not eat for days afterward. Every time she tried, the memory of that smell returned, turning her stomach. She had nightmares about the sound of splitting wood, waking in darkness, convinced she heard it again. The other ladies who shared the vigil suffered similarly. They moved through their duties like ghosts, pale and silent, jumping at sudden noises. The palace physicians quietly discussed what had happened in medical terms. They had warned this would occur. An unembalmed body in warm weather, sealed in an airtight container, was a recipe for exactly this outcome. The gases had built until the structure failed. It was predictable, scientific, but knowing the cause did not make witnessing the effect any less disturbing. The reinforced coffin now sat in its chamber like an accusation. The iron strapping and additional boards transformed it from a royal casket into something crude and industrial. No amount of fresh velvet could hide what it had become. Everyone who entered that room knew what crouched inside those layers of wood and metal. Not the Virgin Queen, not Gloriana, just the remains of a woman whose final wish had led to this indignity. Guards rotated more frequently now. No one wanted to spend extended time with that coffin. The vigil continued because protocol demanded it, but the ladies who sat watch did so with barely concealed dread. They positioned themselves as far from the casket as the room allowed, breathing through perfumed cloth, praying the reinforcements would hold. Word had already been sent to Westminster Abbey. Elizabeth could not remain at Richmond much longer. The funeral procession needed to happen soon, before something else went wrong. Before the horror sealed inside that coffin found another way to escape. The physicians understood the science, even if no one wanted to hear it. What occurred inside Elizabeth's coffin was not supernatural. It was biology following its inevitable course, indifferent to crowns and kingdoms. The human body is never truly alone. Trillions of bacteria live in the digestive system, existing in careful balance while a person breathes. They help digest food, process nutrients, maintain the delicate ecosystem of life. But the moment the heart stops, that balance collapses. The bacteria that once served the body now consume it. Without oxygen, these microorganisms shift their behavior. They begin breaking down the tissues around them, fermenting the dead matter much like yeast ferments grain into alcohol. The byproducts of this process are gases: methane, hydrogen sulfide, cadaverine and putrescine, compounds whose names reveal their origin. These gases accumulate in the abdomen first, where the highest concentration of bacteria resides. In a normal royal burial, surgeons would have removed Elizabeth's organs within hours of death. The stomach, intestines, liver, everything that housed those bacteria would have been extracted and placed in separate vessels. The body cavity would have been washed with wine and vinegar, then packed with preservative herbs. Myrrh, aloes, substances that killed remaining bacteria and absorbed moisture. This process could preserve a corpse for weeks, sometimes months. Elizabeth had forbidden all of it, so her organs remained intact, sealed inside her abdomen. The bacteria went to work immediately, multiplying in the warm March air, consuming tissue, producing gas. With no way for the pressure to escape, her body began to swell. The cerecloth wrapping contained the expansion temporarily, but the gases continued to build. When they sealed her in lead and soldered it shut, they created a perfect pressure chamber. Lead does not breathe. It allows no air in or out. Inside that metal shell, the temperature rose slightly from the heat of decomposition itself. Higher temperature meant faster bacterial growth. Faster growth meant more gas production. The cycle accelerated. The human body can produce an astonishing amount of gas during putrefaction. Medical texts from the period documented cases of bloating so severe that corpses doubled in size. The pressure inside could reach levels capable of rupturing tissue, splitting skin, forcing fluids from every opening. In Elizabeth's case, the lead contained the body itself, but the gases still needed somewhere to go. They pushed outward against the metal walls. The soldered seams held, testament to the craftsmen who had sealed them. But pressure seeks the weakest point, and in this case, it was not the lead. It was the wooden casing surrounding it. Wood is strong but rigid. The nails holding the boards in place prevented any flex or give. As pressure built inside the lead coffin, it pushed against the wood from within. The boards began to bow. The grain of the timber strained. And finally, on that third night, the structure failed exactly as physics demanded it would. The coffin had not exploded. It had simply surrendered to forces that Elizabeth's refusal had set in motion the moment she drew her last breath. 3 weeks had passed since Elizabeth died, and the coffin could remain at Richmond no longer. The funeral had been scheduled for late April at Westminster Abbey, which meant the body needed to be moved to Whitehall Palace, first for the official lying in state. The distance was only 10 miles along the Thames, but those 10 miles filled everyone involved with dread. The reinforced casket now weighed over 400 pounds. Lead alone accounted for much of that weight, but the additional wooden boards and iron strapping had transformed it into something monstrously heavy. 8 strong men would be required just to lift it, and the thought of what they would be carrying made recruitment difficult. Robert Cecil had to personally select pallbearers from the royal household guard, men who could not refuse a direct order. A specially constructed barge waited at the Richmond dock. Workers had reinforced its deck with extra timbers to support the weight. They built a platform in the center, draped in black cloth, where the coffin would rest during the journey. The barge would travel downstream with the tide, escorted by smaller boats carrying officials and witnesses. Speed was essential. The less time the coffin spent in transit, the better. The morning of the move arrived cold and gray. Fog hung over the Thames, muffling sound, turning the world ghostly. The 8 pallbearers assembled at Richmond Palace, their faces grim. They had all heard the rumors about what happened that night. Now they would have to touch it, lift it, carry it down corridors and stairs to the waiting barge. They entered the chamber together. The coffin sat exactly as it had for weeks, wrapped in fresh velvet, surrounded by dying candles. Up close, they could see the crude reinforcements beneath the fabric. This was no longer a queen's casket. It was a container, nothing more. The head pallbearer gave the signal. They positioned themselves, 4 on each side, gripping the iron handles that had been bolted to the wood. On the count, they lifted. The weight was staggering. The coffin rose off its platform, swaying slightly as the men adjusted their grip. Someone whispered a prayer. They began to move. Every step was careful, measured. They navigated doorways, turned corners, descended the main staircase one slow step at a time. The entire palace seemed to hold its breath as they passed. Servants pressed themselves against walls, making room, averting their eyes. No one wanted to look too closely at what those men carried. Outside, the April air provided relief after the closed spaces of the palace. The pallbearers quickened their pace slightly, moving across the courtyard toward the dock. The barge waited, rocking gently in the current. A ramp had been built to ease the transition from shore to deck. Loading the coffin onto the barge required all 8 men plus 4 more waiting aboard. They shuffled forward, muscles straining, until the casket rested on its platform. Ropes were secured around it, lashing it in place. No one wanted to imagine what would happen if it shifted during the journey and fell into the Thames. The barge pushed off, oars cutting through the fog. Behind it, the escort boats followed in solemn procession. On the deck, guards stood watch over the coffin, their hands never far from the ropes securing it. Every creak of wood, every shift of weight, sent tension through them. The reinforcements had held so far, but Elizabeth's body had already proven it could not be controlled. The 10-mile journey felt like crossing an ocean. The barge docked at Whitehall in the early afternoon. The coffin was unloaded with the same painstaking care that had gotten it aboard, then carried through the palace gates into the presence chamber, where Elizabeth would lie in state for the next 3 weeks. This was where England would come to mourn their queen, where thousands would file past to pay their respects. Everything had to appear perfect. But perfection was no longer possible with what rested inside that reinforced casket. The solution arrived that same evening. A team of craftsmen brought with them a life-sized effigy of Elizabeth, carved and painted with meticulous detail. The figure wore one of her actual gowns, cloth of gold that shimmered in candlelight. A rough collar framed the wooden face, painted with the pale complexion Elizabeth had maintained throughout her life. The effigy wore a crown, held a scepter, bore rings on its carved fingers. From even a short distance, it looked startlingly real. They placed the effigy on top of the closed coffin, arranging it to appear as though the queen herself lay in state. This was not unusual. Royal funerals often employed such figures, allowing the public to see their monarch one final time without exposing the actual remains. But in Elizabeth's case, the effigy served a darker purpose. It was not enhancement. It was concealment. The doors opened to the public the following morning. They came in waves, nobles in their mourning blacks, merchants and tradesmen, common folk who had traveled from distant villages just to glimpse the woman who had ruled their entire lives. They filed through the presence chamber in an endless stream, most weeping openly, some reaching out as if to touch the effigy before guards gently redirected them. None of them knew what truly lay beneath that beautiful figure. The coffin was draped in purple velvet embroidered with gold thread. Candles surrounded it in gleaming rows. The effigy's painted eyes stared serenely at the ceiling, its wooden lips curved in the slightest suggestion of a smile. Everything spoke of majesty, of dignity, of a queen at peaceful rest. But beneath the velvet, beneath the carved wood of the effigy, inside the reinforced casket with its iron bands and multiple layers, Elizabeth's body continued its slow dissolution. The lead coffin had contained the worst of it, but those who stood watch in the presence chamber still detected something faint in the air. They burned incense constantly, thick clouds of it, officially to honor the queen, but practically to mask what could not be completely hidden. The ladies assigned to vigil duty knew the truth. They had been at Richmond. They had heard the coffin split. Now they stood in shifts beside the casket, maintaining the illusion for the thousands who passed through. When mourners wept at the effigy's feet, the ladies wept too, though their tears came from different knowledge. A visiting dignitary remarked that Elizabeth looked more beautiful in death than she had in her final years. Another commented on how peaceful she appeared, how the troubles of her reign had smoothed from her face. The ladies said nothing. They simply gestured toward the effigy and allowed the visitors to believe what they needed to believe. The contrast was almost unbearable. Above, the Virgin Queen, eternal and perfect. Below, the reality of mortality that no crown could prevent. April 28, 1603. London woke to church bells tolling across the city. The day had finally arrived. After a month of mourning, of whispered uncertainties about succession, of a kingdom holding its breath, Elizabeth would be laid to rest. The procession assembled at Whitehall Palace before dawn. Over 1,000 mourners gathered in strict hierarchical order, each wearing black robes that transformed the courtyard into a sea of darkness. Nobles, clergy, officials, members of Parliament, representatives from every corner of Elizabeth's realm. They had rehearsed their positions, knew exactly where to stand, understood that this procession would be remembered for generations. The coffin emerged from the presence chamber, carried by 14 earls, the highest-ranking men willing to bear the physical burden. The effigy still rested on top, now secured with black velvet straps to prevent it from shifting during the journey. In the gray morning light, the crowned figure looked almost alive, and several in the crowd gasped when they first saw it pass. Behind the coffin walked the chief mourners. The Marchioness of Northampton, who had known Elizabeth since childhood, led them. Her face was hidden behind a black veil, but her shoulders shook with sobs. The other ladies followed, a line of grief moving through the palace gates and into the London streets. The route had been cleared hours earlier. Every street from Whitehall to Westminster Abbey stood empty of normal traffic, lined instead with thousands of citizens who had waited since first light for a glimpse of the procession. They packed the sides of the road, climbed onto walls and rooftops, pressed against each other in desperate attempts to see. Many had never witnessed a royal funeral. Most had known no other monarch. This was the end of an era passing before their eyes. As the procession moved forward, the sound of weeping rolled through the crowds like a wave. Women sobbed openly. Men removed their caps and held them to their chests. Some reached out as if they could touch the passing coffin, though guards kept everyone at a careful distance. The emotion was genuine and overwhelming. Whatever political calculations would follow, whatever plots were already forming around the succession, in this moment, London mourned. The pallbearers felt every step. The weight remained constant, unforgiving, even distributed among 14 men. They moved in practiced rhythm, their faces set in grim concentration. Beneath their hands, through the wood and velvet, they could feel the vibrations of the procession, the rhythm of their own footfalls transmitted through the casket. Some later admitted they were terrified the reinforcements might fail during the journey, that the coffin might crack open in the middle of London streets. But the iron bands held. The additional boards did their job. The procession took over an hour to cover the short distance. Every step was measured, dignified, slow enough for the crowds to witness, but fast enough to reach Westminster before the April sun climbed too high. Musicians played funeral dirges. Clergymen chanted prayers. The sound mixed with the weeping crowd into something haunting and unforgettable. Finally, Westminster Abbey rose before them, its ancient stones waiting to receive England's last Tudor queen. The Abbey's great doors opened, and the procession entered the cool darkness within. Centuries of stone surrounded them, walls that had witnessed coronations and burials of kings and queens stretching back beyond memory. Today they would witness one more. The coffin was carried down the nave toward the high altar. Every surface had been draped in black cloth. Hundreds of candles burned in sconces along the walls, their flames casting dancing shadows across the vaulted ceiling. The air was thick with incense, so dense it almost obscured the mourners filing into the pews. The abbey could hold thousands, and every space was filled. Archbishop Whitgift waited at the altar, the same man who had prayed beside Elizabeth as she died. He was 83 years old, bent with age, but his voice still carried authority when he began the funeral oration. He spoke of Elizabeth's reign, her wisdom, her strength, her devotion to England. He called her the greatest queen Christendom had ever known. Many in the congregation wept anew. But Whitgift did not mention how she died. He said nothing about her final wishes, nothing about what those wishes had caused. His sermon painted Elizabeth as eternal, unchanging, already more legend than woman. Perhaps that was mercy. Perhaps it was necessary. The truth served no one now. The service lasted 3 hours. Prayers were sung in Latin and English. Choirs performed hymns Elizabeth had loved. Officials read proclamations honoring her memory. Through it all, the coffin rested before the altar, the effigy still perfectly positioned on top, maintaining the illusion one final time. When the service ended, the pallbearers lifted the casket again. They carried it through a side passage toward the Henry VII Chapel, a smaller, more intimate space where Tudor monarchs rested. Henry VII himself lay there with his queen, Elizabeth of York. Their granddaughter would join them now, completing the dynasty they had founded over a century before. The chapel had been prepared. Workers had opened the vault beneath the floor days earlier, revealing a space that already held one coffin. Mary I, Elizabeth's half-sister, had been buried there 45 years ago. Now Elizabeth would be placed directly above her, their lead coffins stacked in the cramped vault, separated by mere inches of air. The symbolism was unavoidable. The two women who had defined their generation, who had imprisoned each other, suspected each other, represented opposing visions of England's faith, would spend eternity pressed together in darkness. Some saw it as reconciliation. Others saw it as continuation of their conflict, frozen forever beneath Westminster stones. The pallbearers lowered the coffin through the vault opening using thick ropes. The descent was slow, careful, until it settled with a heavy thud onto Mary's casket below. The sound echoed through the chapel. Workers immediately began sealing the vault, fitting stone slabs back into place, mortaring the gaps. Archbishop Whitgift spoke the final prayer. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes. The traditional words that made all bodies equal, regardless of the crowns they once wore. The vault sealed shut. Elizabeth was finally at rest. Or so everyone believed. The vault beneath the Henry VII chapel was never meant to hold enemies together. Yet that is exactly what it became. When workers lowered Elizabeth's coffin onto Mary's, they were joining two women who had spent their lives in opposition. Mary I, Bloody Mary, as history would call her, the Catholic queen who had burned Protestants at the stake and desperately tried to restore England to Rome, and Elizabeth, the Protestant queen who had undone everything Mary built, who had made England a Protestant nation, and kept it that way for 45 years. Their relationship had been poisoned from the start. Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, the wife Henry VIII had cast aside. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, the woman who had replaced Catherine and broken England from the Catholic Church. Mary saw Elizabeth as illegitimate, a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. Elizabeth saw Mary as the obstacle standing between her and survival. When Mary took the throne in 1553, Elizabeth became a prisoner. Mary suspected her younger sister of plotting rebellion, of conspiring with Protestants who wanted to overthrow the Catholic Restoration. Elizabeth spent months locked in the Tower of London, the same tower where their father had sent Anne Boleyn to her execution. Every day Elizabeth wondered if she would follow her mother to the scaffold. Mary had the power. Mary had the motive. Only political calculation kept Elizabeth alive. But Mary died childless in 1558, and Elizabeth inherited everything. The sister who had been prisoner became queen. The woman who had lived under constant threat of execution now held absolute power, and she used it to erase Mary's legacy. The Protestant Church was restored. Catholic practices were banned. Mary's attempts to reconcile with Rome became footnotes in history books, overshadowed by Elizabeth's golden age. Now they rested together in a space barely large enough for both coffins. The vault was cramped, utilitarian, nothing like the grand monuments above. Elizabeth's lid casket sat directly on top of Mary's, so close that if either moved even slightly, the metal would scrape against metal. The inscription on Elizabeth's coffin was simple: a Tudor rose, the initials ER, and the year 1603. Below it, invisible in the darkness, Mary's coffin bore similar markings from 1558. Two queens who had defined an era of religious conflict, who had imprisoned and threatened each other, who had represented irreconcilable visions of England's soul, now pressed together in eternal proximity. The irony was almost poetic. In death, they had no choice but to share space, to exist in the same darkness, to become indistinguishable to the stone floor above. Whatever remained of their bodies within those lid shells, whatever bones and dust they would eventually become, would mix in that sealed vault. The air they shared, the moisture that would eventually corrode the metal. The slow passage of centuries would affect them equally. Queens in life, equals in death, companions in darkness, whether they wanted to be or not. The vault sealed above them. The world moved on. And below Westminster's floor, Elizabeth and Mary began their long wait together. The vault sealed in 1603, and for centuries, no one disturbed it. Above, Westminster Abbey continued its daily rhythms. Prayers were sung. Tourists visited. New monarchs were crowned just feet above where Elizabeth and Mary lay forgotten. But below the chapel floor, time moved differently. Lead coffins are designed to last forever, but forever is a promise even metal cannot keep. In the sealed vault, moisture accumulated. England's damp climate seeped through stone, condensing on cold lead surfaces, creating a perpetual wetness that never dried. The lead itself began to corrode, developing a white patina that spread like frost across the surfaces. The process was glacially slow, but relentless. Inside the coffins, the bodies had long since completed their transformation. Within the first year, the soft tissues would have liquefied, breaking down into a thick fluid that pooled at the lowest points. The organs Elizabeth had refused to have removed dissolved completely, leaving only residue. By the 10th year, most of the flesh had vanished, consumed by the bacteria that had caused so much trouble in those first terrible weeks. What remained were bones. Skeletons still arranged in the positions the bodies had been placed, still wearing whatever cerecloth wrappings had survived the moisture. Elizabeth's skull, still bearing traces of the makeup she had worn in death. Her rib cage, perhaps showing the narrowing caused by decades of tight corsets. The long bones of her legs and arms, fragile now, beginning to show the effects of age and damp. The wooden casings around the lead coffins deteriorated faster. Wood rots when exposed to constant moisture. The boards that had been reinforced so desperately at Richmond slowly softened, developing black patches of mold. Beetles found their way into the vault through microscopic cracks, boring through the wood, leaving behind networks of tunnels. By the 100th year, much of the wooden structure had collapsed into fragments. Above, England transformed. The Stuarts rose and fell. Civil war tore the nation apart. Kings were executed and restored. The Hanoverians arrived. Wars raged across Europe. Revolution swept through France. The world Elizabeth had known vanished completely, replaced by ages she could never have imagined. Through it all, her remains lay undisturbed in their decaying lead shell. The vault became a time capsule of forgotten death. Dust settled in layers. Spider webs filled the corners. The air grew stale and thick, devoid of circulation, heavy with the accumulated centuries. The two coffins, now barely recognizable beneath corrosion and decay, pressed together in the darkness, their inscriptions fading, their purpose almost forgotten by a world that had moved on. By 1850, most people who visited Westminster Abbey had no idea Elizabeth and Mary rested there. The vault was marked only by a small memorial plaque, easily overlooked among the Abbey's countless monuments. Tour guides rarely mentioned it. The two queens who had once commanded absolute power had become footnotes, their physical remains hidden away and deteriorating in silence. But in 1869, someone finally remembered. And what they found when they opened that vault would confirm everything the ladies at Richmond had tried so desperately to forget. Dean Arthur Stanley had a historian's curiosity and the authority to satisfy it. As Dean of Westminster Abbey, he controlled access to every corner of the ancient building, including the sealed vaults beneath its floors. In early 1869, he decided it was time to document what lay beneath the Henry VII Chapel. No one had looked inside that vault since 1603. Stanley petitioned Queen Victoria for permission. The request was unusual, but not unprecedented. The Abbey's vaults had been opened before for various reasons, always with royal approval, always with careful documentation. Victoria granted permission in February. stipulating that the examination be conducted with utmost respect and that Stanley publish his findings for historical record. On a cold morning, workers assembled in the Henry VII Chapel with tools and lanterns. They located the vault entrance beneath the floor, marked by stones that had not been disturbed in 2.5 centuries. The mortar had hardened like iron over the decades, and breaking through required careful chiseling to avoid damaging whatever lay beneath. Stanley supervised personally, watching as the workers created a small opening in the vault floor. They did not remove the entire covering, just enough to peer inside and lower a lantern. The goal was observation, not disturbance. Whatever rested below would remain there. This was merely documentation for posterity. When the aperture was finally large enough, Stanley approached with his lantern. He knelt at the edge and looked down into darkness that had been sealed for 266 years. The lantern light flickered across the scene below, and what he saw stopped him cold. The vault was smaller than he expected, barely large enough for the 2 coffins it contained. But it was the condition of those coffins that shocked him. The wooden casings had almost completely disintegrated. Fragments lay scattered across the vault floor, like abandoned debris. The lead coffins beneath were fully exposed, their surfaces dulled by centuries of corrosion, but still intact. Elizabeth's coffin sat on top, exactly as it had been placed. Despite the decay, Stanley could still make out the inscription on the lead surface. The Tudor rose was visible, corroded but recognizable. The initials ER could be read. The date 1603 remained clear. The lead had protected these markings, even as everything around them rotted away. Below Elizabeth's coffin, partially visible, lay Mary's casket. The 2 were so close together that Stanley could barely see where one ended and the other began. They appeared almost fused by time and proximity, 2 separate containers that had become one in the darkness. Stanley remained at the aperture for a long time, studying the scene, making notes. He observed the iron reinforcement bands still wrapped around Elizabeth's coffin, now rusted but still holding. Evidence of the repairs made at Richmond, still visible after all these years. He noted the cramped space, the condition of the lead, the way moisture had affected everything. Finally, he ordered the vault re-sealed. There was nothing more to see, and disturbing the coffins themselves would serve no purpose. He had documented what needed to be documented. That evening, Stanley began writing his findings for publication. When Arthur Stanley set down his pen, the picture he left to history was not of a violated tomb, but of a strange, fragile stillness. His notes described no pried-open lids, no exposed bones, no secret examination of royal remains. The coffins of Elizabeth and Mary were observed, recorded, and then left exactly as they had rested for more than 2.5 centuries. What he saw, however, told its own story. Elizabeth's wooden shell had almost completely vanished, eaten away by damp and time, until only splinters and rusted iron bands clung to the lid beneath. The metal surface was blotched and dulled, but it had done its job. Inside, whatever remained of the Queen, who once terrified Europe, lay undisturbed, sealed behind the same soldered seams that had contained her first violent transformation in 1603. The inscription on the lid had outlived the wood, the textiles, and the hands that had carved it. A single rose, 2 letters, a date. That was all the world was allowed to see of Elizabeth Tudor now. Her face, her body, her infamous coffin, everything else existed only in second-hand accounts and the memories of those who had watched her die. The physical woman was gone. Only a name pressed into lead remained. Mary's coffin, crushed beneath the weight of her sisters, told a similar story. 2 queens who had once commanded armies and rewritten the faith of a nation now occupied less space than a stone slab in the chapel floor. Their vault, so cramped that their coffins almost touched the walls, might as well have been another storage niche in the Abbey's undercroft. No jewels, no golden sarcophagi, just lead, corrosion, and the quiet work of centuries. What struck Stanley most was how ordinary it all seemed. The great Elizabethan myth, Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the brilliant ruler whose image had been carefully crafted in life, ended in the same way as every other human story, hidden in darkness, reduced to bones and dust inside a rust-stained shell. For all the legends that had grown around her name, the reality beneath Westminster was simple and absolute. After the brief examination, masons closed the aperture and sealed the stone again. The chapel floor returned to its smooth, unbroken surface. Visitors walked over it, unaware that two of England's most famous monarchs lay directly beneath their feet. Stanley's account went into print, not as a scandal, but as a quiet piece of documentation. There was no attempt to hide what he had seen. There was simply nothing sensational to conceal. And so Elizabeth remained where her funeral had left her, stacked above the sister who once threatened her life, held in place by the same lead that had withstood the explosion of her corpse, guarded not by soldiers, but by stone, tradition, and time. The woman whose body had once forced its way out of its first wooden prison would never break through this last one. Her final secret stayed in the dark, locked in a coffin no one has opened. And if history continues, as it has no one ever will,